Deep in the dusty archives of emergency room toxicology reports, there exists a recurring narrative that chills even the most hardened medical professionals. A patient arrives screaming at invisible demons, frantically picking at phantom insects crawling beneath their skin, and holding long, coherent conversations with relatives who have been dead for over a decade. They are not suffering from sudden-onset schizophrenia, nor are they under the influence of standard psychedelics like LSD or mushrooms. They are the victims of a beautiful, white, trumpet-shaped flower that likely grows in a neglected garden down your street. This is Datura, often known as Jimson Weed or the devil's trumpet, a plant so deceptive that it does not merely distort reality, it completely replaces it. Unlike other substances that might offer euphoria or colorful geometric patterns, Datura offers only true delirium, a waking nightmare where the user loses the ability to distinguish between hallucination and the physical world. For the next hour, we will walk through the dark history of this botanical poison, from the ancient rituals of sorcerers to the tragic madness of modern explorers who underestimated its power. Welcome to the Midnight Vault, where we peel back the pale petals of the witch's flower to reveal the eternal nightmare hiding within. Chapter 1. The Botany of Madness. To understand the horror of Datura, one must first look at the plant itself. For there are few living things in the botanical world that possess such a terrifying duality between beauty and malice. If you were to walk through a dry riverbed in the American Southwest, or perhaps stumble upon a neglected patch of soil on the outskirts of a European city, you might encounter a bush that looks surprisingly elegant amidst the weeds. It is a member of the Solanaceae family, the nightshades, making it a distant cousin to the tomato, the potato, and the eggplant. But unlike its edible relatives, every single cell of this plant is saturated with a chemical code designed to dismantle the human mind. It is often called the moonflower because of its nocturnal blooming cycle. As the sun sets and the world grows dark, the Datura plant awakens. Its large, trumpet-shaped flowers unfurl, revealing a pristine, creamy white interior that seems to glow in the moonlight. They release a fragrance that is intoxicatingly sweet, heavy, and perfume-like, designed by evolution to attract the sphinx moth, its primary pollinator. This sweetness is the first trap. To the uneducated eye, it looks like an ornamental masterpiece, a perfect addition to a garden. But look closer, and the warnings are there. The leaves are jagged and toothed, emitting a foul, nauseating odor when crushed, often described as the smell of rancid peanut butter. The seed pods are even more aggressive, green golf ball-sized spheres covered in sharp, vicious spines, earning the plant one of its many sinister nicknames, the thorn apple. Nature is rarely subtle when it signals danger, and the spiky armor of the Datura seed pod is a clear message: stay away. Yet throughout history, humans have ignored this warning. The danger of Datura lies not just in its toxicity, but in its supreme unpredictability. It is a game of biological Russian roulette. The concentration of toxins within the plant varies wildly, depending on the age of the bush, the composition of the soil, the amount of rainfall, and even the time of day. Two leaves picked from the same plant, just hours apart, can have vastly different chemical potencies. One seed pod might induce a mild stupor. Another, identical in appearance, might contain a lethal dose that stops the heart before the hallucinations even begin. This volatility is why Datura is almost never found in the recreational drug market. It cannot be dosed. It cannot be predicted. It is a chaotic force of nature that refuses to be tamed. The engine of this chaos is a trio of tropane alkaloids that act as the plant's defense mechanism: atropine, hyoscyamine, and scopolamine. In the world of toxicology, this is an unholy trinity. To understand what they do to a human being, we have to look at the brain's communication system. Normally, your brain uses a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine to send messages throughout your body. Acetylcholine is responsible for the rest and digest system. It regulates your heartbeat, your sweat glands, your saliva production, and your memory formation. It is the chemical messenger that keeps you grounded in reality and keeps your body functioning smoothly. When Datura enters the bloodstream, whether eaten, smoked, or brewed into a tea, these alkaloids launch a hostile takeover. They are classified as anticholinergic agents. They essentially flood the synaptic clefts of your nervous system and block the receptors for acetylcholine. Imagine cutting the phone lines to a city's emergency services. The signals are being sent, but nobody is picking up. The result is a cascade of physiological failures, known in medical textbooks as the anticholinergic toxidrome. Medical students have used a macabre mnemonic rhyme for over a century to memorize the symptoms of Datura poisoning. It goes like this: hot as a hare, blind as a bat, dry as a bone, red as a beet, and mad as a hatter. This nursery rhyme of death perfectly describes the physical hell a user endures before the mental nightmare even sets in. First, dry as a bone. As the alkaloids shut down the parasympathetic nervous system, all moisture in the body evaporates. Saliva production stops instantly. The mouth becomes akin to sandpaper, making it nearly impossible to swallow or speak. The eyes dry out, scratching against the eyelids. The skin loses its ability to sweat. This leads to the second phase, hot as a hare. Without sweat to cool the body down, the internal temperature begins to skyrocket. The victim burns from the inside out, often tearing off their clothes in a desperate attempt to cool down, even in freezing weather. This hyperthermia can lead to seizures, rhabdomyolysis, and permanent brain damage. Then comes blind as a bat. The pupils dilate to an enormous size, swallowing the iris completely. They lose the ability to constrict in response to light. The world becomes a blur of painful brightness, and near vision becomes impossible. A user cannot read a text message, cannot see the hands on a clock, and cannot recognize the face of the person standing directly in front of them. This is often followed by red as a beet, as the blood vessels near the surface of the skin dilate in a futile attempt to shed the excess heat, turning the victim's skin a flushed crimson red. But the final line of the rhyme, mad as a hatter, is where the true horror of Datura resides. This is the point of no return. It is crucial here to make a sharp distinction between the effects of classic psychedelics, like LSD or psilocybin, and the effects of a deliriant like Datura. When someone takes a high dose of LSD, they might see walls breathing or colors shifting, but a part of their mind usually retains the observer status. They know they have taken a drug. They know that the melting wall is a hallucination. There is a separation between the self and the visual distortion. Datura offers no such mercy. It dissolves the boundary between the internal mind and the external world. It produces true hallucinations. If you see a person standing in the corner of the room on Datura, that person is as real to you as the chair you are sitting on. You can speak to them, hear their voice, and feel their presence. Users frequently report having mundane conversations with friends or family members, only to turn away for a second and look back to find the room empty, realizing hours later that the person they were talking to has been dead for years. The brain, stripped of its ability to process sensory input correctly, begins to construct a new reality from the subconscious memory banks. This state of delirium is often characterized by repetitive, phantom behaviors. The most common of these is the phenomenon of the phantom cigarette. Smokers who ingest Datura almost universally report the sensation of holding a cigarette between their fingers. They can feel the weight of it, see the smoke rising, and feel the hit in their lungs. They will smoke the entire cigarette, flick the ash, and drop the butt, only to look down at their hand and realize there was never anything there. They will then immediately repeat the process, dozens of times, trapped in a loop of neurological static. Others report more sinister visions. The spiders are a recurring motif in Datura experiences. Unlike the geometric patterns of psychedelics, Datura hallucinations are often dark, earthy, and hyper-realistic. Swarms of insects, phantom spiders spinning webs across doorways, or black sludge oozing from the walls. Because the drug inhibits memory formation, the user often forgets they have taken anything at all. They are simply thrust into a waking nightmare where the laws of physics and logic no longer apply, and they accept this new reality without question. The duration of this madness is perhaps the most punishing aspect of the plant's biology. While a mushroom trip might last 6 hours, and LSD might last 12, the alkaloids in Datura bind to the receptors with a tenacious grip. The liver struggles to break them down. A Datura trip does not measure in hours, but in days. The acute delirium can last for up to 48 hours, followed by a period of twilight that can stretch for 2 weeks. During this time, the user experiences lingering blurred vision, confusion, and a complete inability to read text. Many victims who survive the initial toxicity end up hospitalized not because of the poison itself, but because they wandered into traffic, walked off rooftops, or drowned in shallow water, chasing phantoms that only they could see. It is a plant that seems to have been designed to punish curiosity. In the wild, it is a survivor, thriving in wastelands where other plants die. It demands respect, and it exacts a heavy toll on those who disrespect it. But before modern teenagers were daring each other to eat the seeds on internet forums, and before emergency rooms were familiar with the red, dry, and mad symptoms, this plant had a different role. It was not a street drug, but a sacred key. For thousands of years, across continents separated by vast oceans, humanity has had a relationship with the devil's trumpet. From the Oracle of Delphi to the shamans of the Amazon, the ancestors knew something that we have forgotten. Datura is not a recreational substance. It is a gatekeeper to the spirit world, and the gatekeeper is cruel. To understand how a plant this dangerous became a part of human history, we must look back to a time when the line between medicine, magic, and poison was not just blurred, it was non-existent. But our journey into the past begins with a specific incident, a moment in American history where the effects of this plant were documented with such terrified precision that it gave the weed its most famous American name. We must travel back to the colony of Virginia in the year 1676 to a small settlement called Jamestown. Chapter 2. Jamestown, 1676. The origin of Jimson Weed. The year is 1676, and the location is the humid, mosquito-ridden wilderness of the Virginia colony. To understand how Datura earned its most famous American name, we must first understand the desperation of the men who ate it. This was not a time of peace. The colony was tearing itself apart in a conflict known as Bacon's Rebellion, an armed uprising by Virginia settlers led by Nathaniel Bacon against the rule of Governor William Berkeley. It was a chaotic civil war fought in the swamps and forests, pitting colonist against colonist, and the British Crown against its own subjects. To quell this insurrection, the Crown dispatched a regiment of British regulars, Redcoats. These were men disciplined in the art of European warfare, trained to stand in lines and fire muskets on open fields. But in the dense, suffocating heat of the American South, They were strangers in a strange land. They were ill-equipped for the terrain, unaccustomed to the climate, and, most importantly, they were starving. Supply lines in the 17th century were fragile things, easily broken by weather or enemy raids. As the regiment marched through the area surrounding Jamestown, their rations dwindled to nothing. Hunger is a primal force. It overrides caution and dulls the instinct for self-preservation. It was in this state of caloric deficit that the soldiers stumbled upon a patch of lush, green vegetation growing abundantly in the fertile soil near the James River. To the untrained eye of an Englishman, the young leaves of Datura stramonium looked remarkably benign. They bore a striking resemblance to potherbs or spinach, common edible greens back home. It seemed like a stroke of divine luck, a fresh, limitless source of food just waiting to be harvested. The soldiers, driven by the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs, gathered great armfuls of the plant. They did not know that the local indigenous tribes avoided this plant with a fearful respect. They did not know that the very soil they stood on was feeding a chemical factory of delirium. They simply saw food. They brought the leaves back to camp and began to prepare a meal. In doing so, they inadvertently performed a chemistry experiment that would seal their fate. They chopped the leaves and threw them into large pots of boiling water to make a stew. This is a crucial detail. Had they eaten the leaves raw, the bitter taste might have stopped them after a few bites. But by boiling the plant, they broke down the cellular walls of the leaves. The heat extracted the tropane alkaloids, scopolamine, atropine, and hyoscyamine, pulling them out of the plant matter and infusing them directly into the broth. They were essentially brewing a hyper-concentrated tea of pure madness. The soldiers sat down to eat. The stew likely tasted bitter, perhaps earthy, but hunger makes the best sauce. They consumed it all: the greens, the broth, the poison. They had no idea that they were about to partake in the most infamous meal in the history of American toxicology. What happened next was recorded for history not by a physician, but by a historian and brother-in-law to the governor, a man named Robert Beverly. In his 1705 book, The History and Present State of Virginia, Beverly provides a detailed, almost clinical account of the mass poisoning. He famously described the event not as a tragedy, but as a very pleasant comedy. This choice of words might seem grotesque to modern ears, but it underscores the bizarre, surreal nature of Datura delirium. It is not always a scene of screaming terror. From the outside, it often looks like sheer, nonsensical absurdity. The onset would have begun within 30 to 60 minutes. The first signs were physical. As the anticholinergic toxins flooded their bloodstreams, the soldiers' mouths would have gone instantly bone dry. No amount of water could quench their thirst. Their pupils would have blown open, swallowing their irises until their eyes were black pools, letting in so much light that the midday sun became blindingly painful. Their skin would have flushed hot and red as their bodies lost the ability to sweat. And then, the anchor of reality snapped. The discipline of the British Army, built on centuries of tradition and drill, dissolved in an hour. The regiment descended into a carnival of chaos. According to Beverly's account, the hallucinations were vivid, total, and completely individualized. One soldier, a grown man trained to kill, became convinced he was a feather. He did not just think he was a feather. He embodied the physics of one. He spent hours blowing into the air, twirling and spinning, desperately trying to keep himself afloat on the wind, terrified of hitting the ground. Another soldier believed he was a master carpenter. He found a pile of twigs and dirt and began furiously constructing a phantom house. He mimed the motions of sawing wood, hammering nails, and measuring dimensions. fully immersed in a construction project that existed only in his mind. A third soldier stripped stark naked, abandoning his uniform and his dignity. He sat in the corner of the camp, crouched like a monkey, grinning and making grotesque faces at his comrades through the bars of an invisible cage. Perhaps the most disturbing behavior described was the affectionate madness. One soldier, completely detached from the battlefield, would fondly kiss and paw his companions. He was driven by a confused, delirious euphoria, unable to recognize his fellow soldiers as men, perhaps seeing them as long-lost lovers or childhood pets. Others became paranoid and combative. Beverly writes of men darting straws at invisible enemies, fighting life-or-death duels with thin air, screaming at demons that were not there. The camp turned into a bedlam, a scene straight out of a Hieronymus Bosch painting. The commanders, those few officers who had perhaps eaten less of the stew or arrived late to the meal, were helpless. They stood amidst the chaos, shouting orders that fell on deaf ears. You cannot command a man who believes he is a feather to stand at attention. You cannot reason with a brain that has had its communication lines severed. Realizing that the situation was spiraling out of control and fearing that the delirious soldiers would wander into the woods to die of exposure, drown in the river, or accidentally shoot each other, the commanders made a difficult decision. They were forced to round up their own men like cattle. They confined the delirious troops inside a secure area, essentially creating a makeshift asylum in the middle of the Virginia wilderness. And then they waited. This is where the true horror of Datura reveals itself, distinguishing it from almost any other intoxicant known to man. The duration. If the soldiers had been drunk on rum, they would have slept it off by morning. If they had eaten magic mushrooms, they would have been back to normal in 6 hours. But Datura is relentless. The alkaloids bind to the brain's muscarinic receptors with a tenacious chemical grip, and the body struggles to flush them out. The madness of the Jamestown soldiers did not last for an afternoon. It did not last for a night. According to the historical record, the regiment remained in this state of delirium for 11 days. Imagine the scene. For 11 days and nights, the camp echoed with the sounds of lunacy. 11 days of babbling conversations with the dead. 11 days of grasping at invisible objects. 11 days of the monkey soldier grinning in the corner. The physical toll on the men would have been immense. Their hearts were racing at 100 beats per minute or more, constantly. Their mucous membranes were parched. They were burning up with fever. Yet their minds were trapped in a loop of time, completely divorced from the Virginia soil beneath their feet. When the fog finally lifted, nearly 2 weeks later, the soldiers returned to themselves. But the strangest and perhaps most merciful part of the ordeal was yet to come. Beverly notes that when they finally recovered, they had absolutely no memory of the event. The amnesia was total. It was a clean slate. They did not remember the monkey-like behavior, the invisible houses, the feather dancing, or the kissing. They likely woke up confused, incredibly thirsty, with blurred vision that would persist for weeks, wondering why they were locked up and why they had lost nearly half a month of their lives. It was as if the drug had simply cut that portion of their existence out of the timeline with a pair of scissors. This incident was so notorious, so singular in its weirdness, that it rippled through the folklore of the New World. The story was told around campfires and in taverns across the colonies. The plant responsible for the pleasant comedy earned a permanent name in the American lexicon. The locals began calling it the Jamestown Weed. Language, like history, erodes over time. Over decades of Southern drawl, rapid speech, and linguistic drift, Jamestown Weed was slurred and shortened. The town was dropped. The James was softened. By the early 19th century, it had simply become Jimson Weed. It is a name born from a specific moment of chaos. Today, the plant still grows in that same region of Virginia, and indeed across most of the United States. It grows in abandoned lots, along highways, and in suburban backyards. When you hear a news report today about a teenager in Ohio or Florida overdosing on Jimson Weed after reading about it on the internet, you are hearing a direct echo of that doomed dinner in 1676. The name itself is a warning label disguised as a noun, a testament to the time an entire British regiment was defeated not by bullets, but by a salad. However, while the British soldiers were accidental victims of the plant, suffering from ignorance and hunger, they were latecomers to its history. Long before the redcoats boiled it for dinner, and long before modern emergency rooms began treating it, Datura was already woven into the deepest fabrics of human spirituality and magic. Across the ocean in Europe, and further south in the Americas, the plant was not viewed merely as a toxic weed to be avoided. It was viewed as a tool, a dangerous double-edged sword that, if handled with terrifying precision, could unlock the doors of perception. To understand the darker, more intentional use of this plant, we must leave the American colonies and travel back to the shadowed forests of medieval Europe. We must explore how this devil's trumpet became the secret ingredient behind one of the most enduring and misunderstood myths of folklore: the witch on her broomstick. Chapter 3. Witches, Magic, the Ancient World. If the soldiers at Jamestown were the accidental victims of the devil's trumpet, stumbling into madness through ignorance and hunger, they were merely tourists in a realm where others had built permanent residences. While the British redcoats viewed the plant as a poisonous nuisance, history reveals a much darker, more intentional relationship between humanity and the Solanaceae family. For thousands of years, across cultures separated by oceans and ideologies, this plant was not avoided. It was hunted. It was harvested. And it was revered as the ultimate gatekeeper to the spirit world. To understand why, we must look beyond the toxicity and see the utility. In the hands of a fool, Datura is a poison, but in the hands of a master, a shaman, a sorcerer, or a priest, it was a technology. It was a chemical key designed to unlock the cage of the human body and allow the soul to fly. Our journey into this intentional darkness begins in the shadow of medieval Europe, a time when the boundaries between medicine, magic, and religion were dangerously thin. Here we encounter the Solanaceae sisters, a family of plants that share the same deadly alkaloid profile as Datura. While Datura stramonium, Jimson weed, is native to the Americas, its Old World cousins, belladonna, deadly nightshade, henbane, and mandrake, ruled the European forests. They, along with the African and Asian species of Datura, formed the botanical backbone of what historians call the hexing herbs. During the height of the witch trials and the hysteria of the Inquisition, whispered stories circulated about the witches' Sabbath. Peasants and inquisitors alike believed that witches possessed the supernatural ability to fly. They claimed these women could straddle broomsticks and soar through the night sky to meet the devil at unholy gatherings on mountaintops. For centuries, this was dismissed as mere folklore or the hysterical confessions of tortured women. But modern pharmacology suggests that these stories were not entirely invented. They were misinterpreted trip reports. The witches, or more accurately, the wise women, herbalists, and healers of the time, knew a secret about the nightshades. They knew that eating the berries of belladonna or the seeds of Datura was a death sentence. The stomach absorbs the alkaloids too quickly, stopping the heart. However, they discovered that these fat-soluble toxins could be absorbed slowly and safely through the skin, particularly the mucous membranes. Thus, the flying ointment, or unguentum sabati, was born. This was a thick, green salve created by crushing the seeds and leaves of Datura, henbane, and mandrake into a base of animal fat. But where did they apply it? To avoid lethal toxicity, they needed areas of the body where the skin was thin and rich in blood vessels. The armpits were one location. But the most effective method of delivery involved the pelvic region. This brings us to the most enduring symbol of Halloween, the broomstick. Historical court records and investigations from the 15th and 16th centuries suggest that the broomstick was actually an applicator. The wooden handle would be coated with the hallucinogenic ointment. The user would then ride the broomstick, pressing the anointed wood against their sensitive mucous membranes. The resulting experience explains the myth perfectly. Scopolamine, one of the primary alkaloids in Datura and nightshades, has a profound effect on the vestibular system of the ear, which controls balance and spatial orientation. At high doses, it creates a powerful sensation of weightlessness, of lifting off the ground, of floating. Combined with the vivid, delirious hallucinations of demons, beasts, and orgiastic gatherings, the user would fall into a deep trance in their bedroom, yet their mind would vividly experience flying across the countryside to dance with spirits. When they awoke, no one could convince them they hadn't left the room. They had flown. The magic was not in the broom, it was in the chemistry. But while Europe drove these practices underground, condemning them as satanic, other cultures embraced the plant openly, weaving it into the very fabric of their religion. If we travel east to the Indian subcontinent, we find Datura held in the hand of a god. In Hinduism, Datura is inextricably linked to Lord Shiva, the destroyer. He is one of the three supreme deities, responsible for the destruction of the universe to pave the way for rebirth. It is fitting, then, that his sacred flower is one that destroys the mind to reveal the soul. In iconography and temple carvings, the prickly fruit of the Datura plant is often depicted adorning Shiva's matted hair or placed as an offering on his altars. The plant is known in Sanskrit as Datura. The association comes from the legend of the churning of the ocean of milk, where Shiva consumed a lethal poison to save the universe, turning his throat blue. Because he is the master of poisons, he is the only one who can handle the toxicity of Datura. For the sadhus, the wandering, ash-smeared holy men who dedicate their lives to Shiva, Datura is sometimes used as a sacrament. Unlike the accidental poisoning of the British soldiers, the sadhus use it with terrifying precision. They might smoke the seeds mixed with cannabis in a clay chillum or consume small, calculated amounts. The goal is not recreational. It is not to get high in the Western sense. The goal is moksha, liberation. By inducing a state of delirium, the sadhu breaks the chains of the material reality, Maya. They seek to obliterate the ego, to forget their names, their pasts, and their physical bodies, merging their consciousness with the chaotic energy of Shiva. It is a path of extreme spiritual risk, mirroring the destructive nature of the god they serve. However, perhaps the most profound and structured use of this plant is found not in the mountains of India or the cottages of Europe, but in the dry canyons of North America. Here, among the indigenous tribes of California and the Southwest, such as the Chumash, the Zuni, and the Yokuts, Datura was the central pillar of spiritual life. They called it Toloache, or Momoy. For these tribes, Datura was not just a plant, she was a grandmother spirit, a strict and powerful teacher. The most critical use of toloache was in the initiation rites of young men. This was the coming-of-age ceremony, a bridge between childhood and adulthood that every boy had to cross. The ritual was solemn and terrifying. Under the guidance of a shaman, a man who had spent a lifetime building a relationship with the spirit of the plant, the boys would be gathered in a sacred enclosure. They were given a drink made from the crushed roots of the Datura plant. This is significant because the roots are often the most potent and unpredictable part of the plant. The shaman's role was vital. He was the dosage controller. He looked at the boy's size, his temperament, and his spirit, and estimated exactly how much poison he could withstand without dying. It was a razor-thin line. If the dose was too low, the boy would not break through to the spirit world. If the dose was too high, the boy would never return. Once the liquid was consumed, the boys would drift into a comatose delirium that could last for days. The tribe would watch over their motionless bodies, singing songs to guide them through the darkness. Inside the mind of the initiate, a battle was raging. The boy was expected to meet his spirit helper or dream helper, an animal spirit like a hawk, a coyote, or a bear, that would guide him for the rest of his life. This was not a gentle hallucination. It was an ordeal. The boy had to navigate a terrifying landscape of monsters and confusion to find his guide. If he panicked, he might be lost in the madness. If he surrendered, he might die. When the boy finally awoke, days later, parched, weak, and trembling, he was no longer a child. He had looked death in the face. He had dissolved his reality and reassembled it. He was now a man of the tribe, carrying a secret name and a spiritual ally that only he knew. But there was a dark side to this ritual as well. Not every boy woke up. The historical records and oral traditions admit that fatalities happened. It was accepted as a tragic but necessary part of the process. The plant had rejected the initiate. This element of mortality added gravity to the ritual. It taught the tribe that the spirit world was not a playground. It was a place of supreme danger that demanded total respect. This is the crucial difference between the ancient world and the modern world. In the Chumash ritual, the trip was guided, contained, and purposeful. It was surrounded by elders, songs, and centuries of wisdom. Today, that context has been stripped away. The shaman has been replaced by a Reddit thread. The sacred enclosure has been replaced by a teenager's locked bedroom. The reverence has been replaced by boredom. When we look back at the witches of Europe, the sadhus of India, and the tribes of America, we see a unified truth. They understood that Datura was a sentient force. They approached it with fear and trembling. They knew that to enter the eternal nightmare without a guide was an act of suicide. Unfortunately, the modern world has largely forgotten these lessons. We have kept the plant, but we have lost the manual. As we move into the 20th and 21st centuries, Datura leaves the realm of temples and rituals and enters the realm of urban legends, desperate teenagers, and internet challenges. The results, as we will see, are catastrophic. The plant has not changed. Its alkaloids are as potent as ever. But we have changed. We have lost our fear. And for that, the devil's trumpet exacts a heavy price. Chapter 4. The Victorian Era. The Poisoners. As the world marched into the 19th century, the relationship between humanity and the devil's trumpet underwent a strange transformation. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and science was beginning to strip away the mysticism of the past. The ancient shamans were replaced by pharmacists, and the sacred rituals were replaced by patent medicines. Datura, once the tool of the witch and the high priest, found a new home: the Victorian medicine cabinet. It is one of the darkest ironies in medical history that during the 1800s and early 1900s, Datura stramonium was not feared as a poison, but celebrated as a cure. If you were a citizen of Victorian London or New York suffering from asthma or bronchitis, your doctor would not prescribe you an inhaler. He would prescribe you a cigarette. These were known as asthma cigarettes or asthma powders. Brands like Potter's Asthma Cure and Grimaud's Indian cigarettes were sold openly in general stores and apothecaries. The logic behind this was actually rooted in sound science, albeit a dangerous one. The alkaloids in Datura, specifically atropine, are powerful bronchodilators. When inhaled, the smoke paralyzes the smooth muscles of the lungs, forcing the airways to open and temporarily relieving the wheezing of an asthma attack. Imagine the scene: a refined Victorian lady, perhaps even a child, sitting in a parlor gasping for breath. To heal them, they are given a cigarette made of crushed Datura leaves. As they inhale the smoke, the asthma subsides, but the toxins enter the bloodstream. There are countless medical reports from this era of patients who smoked too many of these cigarettes and descended into temporary madness. One medical journal from 1880 describes an elderly woman who, after smoking a stramonium cigarette for her cough, spent the next 6 hours meticulously plucking invisible feathers from her bedsheets and conversing with her deceased husband. The Victorians were inadvertently microdosing themselves with a deliriant. They were walking a tightrope between respiratory relief and total psychosis, sold to them in a tin box for a few pennies. But while the West was trying to tame the plant for profit, the East knew better. In the shadows of the British Empire, specifically in colonial India, Datura was earning a reputation not as a medicine, but as the perfect tool for a crime so insidious it terrified the occupying British forces. This was the era of the Thuggee cult, or simply the Thugs. These were organized gangs of highway robbers who roamed the vast roadways of India, preying on travelers. While the Thugs are most famous for their use of the rumal, a yellow scarf used for strangulation, many factions preferred a weapon that left no mark: Datura. The British authorities began to notice a disturbing pattern. Travelers would be found wandering the roads in a state of complete stupefaction, stripped of their possessions and clothes, unable to speak or remember their own names. Others were found dead, with no signs of violence on their bodies. The weapon was Datura seeds, ground into a fine powder and mixed into curry or sweetmeats. The Thugs had mastered the dosage. They didn't always want to kill. They wanted to incapacitate. A specific dose of Datura creates a state of twilight sleep, a condition where the victim is awake but stripped of all free will and memory. The victim becomes a puppet. They would happily hand over their jewelry, eat more of the poisoned food, or simply sit quietly while the robbers looted their caravan. A British toxicology report from the 1860s detailed the harrowing recovery of these victims. Those who survived the poisoning often suffered from permanent dementia. The scopolamine had fried their neural pathways. The British dubbed these incidents Datura poisoning, and it became a major obsession of colonial forensic science. They realized that Datura was the ultimate clean weapon. It was tasteless when mixed with strong spices, odorless, and if the victim died, it looked like a natural death from heat stroke or fever, common killers in India. However, the most terrifying application of this slavery of the will was not found in India, nor in the pharmacies of London. To find the darkest chapter in the plant's history, we must look to the Caribbean, specifically to the island of Haiti. Here, Datura became the secret ingredient in a phenomenon that Hollywood has turned into a joke, but which is, in reality, a fate worse than death: the creation of the zombie. For decades, Western scientists dismissed the Haitian zombie as pure folklore, superstitious stories of corpses rising from the grave. But in the 1980s, an ethnobotanist named Wade Davis traveled to Haiti to investigate the case of Clervius Narcisse. Narcisse was a man who had been declared dead by 2 American doctors at a hospital. He was buried in 1962. 18 years later, he walked back into his village, alive. Davis's research, published in the book The Serpent and the Rainbow, proposed a terrifying pharmacological explanation. The zombification process was not magic, it was chemistry. The Bokor, sorcerer, used a 2-stage poison. The first stage involved a powder containing tetrodotoxin, derived from the pufferfish. This potent neurotoxin would paralyze the victim completely, slowing their heart rate and breathing to a point where they appeared clinically dead. The family would mourn, a funeral would be held, and the corpse would be buried. But the victim was not dead. They were fully conscious, trapped in a paralyzed body, listening to the dirt being shoveled onto their own coffin. Hours later, under the cover of night, the Bokor would return and dig up the grave. He would drag the victim out and administer the second stage of the poison, the zombie cucumber. This was Datura stramonium. Why Datura? Because the victim, having survived the trauma of burial and the pufferfish toxin, might regain their senses and try to escape or attack the sorcerer. The Datura paste was force-fed to them to shatter their mind. The scopolamine induced a permanent state of delirium, amnesia, and compliance. It severed the connection between the frontal lobe, willpower, and the rest of the brain. The zombie was then led away to work as a slave on a sugar plantation. They were kept in a constant state of Datura intoxication, given regular doses to keep them docile, confused, and disconnected from their past lives. They were not the flesh-eating monsters of movies. They were tragic, hollowed-out shells of human beings, chemically lobotomized by the devil's trumpet. This revelation recontextualized the horror of the plant. In the hands of the shaman, Datura was a key to the spirit world. In the hands of the Bokor, it was a lock on the human soul. It demonstrated that the plant itself is neutral. It is a biological amplifier of human intent. If you seek God, it shows you God. If you seek to enslave, it provides the chains. As the 20th century progressed, the use of Datura for murder and enslavement faded into the background, replaced by more modern synthetic drugs. The asthma cigarettes were banned as medicine advanced, the thugs were disbanded, the zombies became myths. But the plant did not disappear. It retreated to the edges of society. It grew in the cracks of the pavement, in the neglected corners of public parks, and in the flower beds of unsuspecting grandmothers. It lay dormant, waiting for a new generation to discover it. And discover it they did. But this new generation did not have the discipline of the shaman, the desperation of the Victorian asthmatic, or the calculated malice of the sorcerer. They were bored teenagers with internet connections. They were psychonauts, looking for a legal high, armed with nothing but curiosity and bad information. This brings us to the modern era, the era of the Trip Report, the era of Arrowhead and Reddit, a time when the horror of Datura is not inflicted by an enemy, but self-inflicted in the pursuit of a cheap thrill. As we move into the final chapters of our story, We will leave the history books behind and enter the emergency rooms of the 21st century, where the eternal nightmare is no longer a myth, but a viral video waiting to happen. Chapter 5. The Modern Nightmare. The Phantom Cigarette. We now leave the dusty pages of history books, the candlelit rituals of the occult, and the colonial forests of Virginia. We arrive in the present day. The setting is no longer a temple or a battlefield. It is a suburban bedroom, illuminated by the blue glow of a computer screen. The shaman has been replaced by a search engine. The ancient wisdom has been replaced by a Reddit thread, and the users are no longer seeking God or enlightenment. They are seeking a high. This is the era of the internet psychonaut. In the vast, unregulated marketplace of information, curious teenagers and bored thrill-seekers often stumble upon Datura stramonium. They learn that it is legal. They learn that it grows wild in their own neighborhoods, perhaps even in their own backyards. And most dangerously, they learn that it is a hallucinogen. To the uninitiated mind, the word hallucinogen carries a specific connotation. It suggests the colorful geometric visuals of LSD, the philosophical introspection of magic mushrooms, or the euphoria of MDMA. There is a tragic misconception that legal implies safe, or at least manageable. The logic follows a naive path. If it grows in the ground and the police don't arrest you for it, how bad can it be? The answer, as thousands of modern emergency room reports can attest, is worse than you can possibly imagine. The modern Datura experience usually begins with a simple, fatal error in dosage. A user reads online that 10 seeds produce a mild effect, but they don't know that the plant in their garden is 3 times more potent than the one described on the forum. They eat 30 seeds. Or they boil a single leaf into a tea, drinking the entire cup in one gulp. The first hour is deceptive. There is no immediate rush, just a dry mouth, a slight dizziness. The user might think, it's not working, and make the catastrophic mistake of consuming more. But the biological clock has already started ticking. As the anticholinergic toxidrome sets in, the physical punishment begins. The throat becomes so dry that swallowing is impossible. The skin becomes hot and red. But the defining characteristic of the modern Datura trip, the thing that separates it from every other drug experience, is the nature of the hallucinations. We must clarify the medical distinction between a psychedelic and a deliriant. On a psychedelic like acid, the walls might breathe, but you know you are on a drug. On a deliriant like Datura, the walls don't breathe. Instead, a SWAT team kicks down your door. You see them. You hear the wood splinter. You hear them shouting your name. You feel the cold metal of the handcuffs. You are terrified. You scream for your parents, and 5 hours later, you are found cowering in your closet, alone, in a house that has been silent all night. This is true hallucinations. The brain, starved of acetylcholine, loses the ability to distinguish between internal thought and external reality. It projects your subconscious fears onto the canvas of the real world with perfect, high-definition clarity. Among the thousands of trip reports archived on sites like arrowid.org, there are recurring motifs, specific hallucinations that happen to almost everyone, regardless of where they live or who they are. It is as if the plant contains a pre-programmed horror movie. The most famous of these is the phantom cigarette. It is a phenomenon so common, it has become legendary in the drug community. A user, often someone who smokes regularly, will feel the sudden, overwhelming urge for a cigarette. They will reach into their pocket, pull out a pack, extract a cigarette, and light it. They feel the texture of the filter between their lips. They see the orange glow of the cherry. They feel the smoke fill their lungs and the relief of the nicotine. They watch the smoke curl into the air. They flick the ash into an ashtray, and then they drop it. They look down to pick it up, and it's gone. Their hand is empty. There is no cigarette. There never was. The brain is so confused that it simply runs a loop of a familiar muscle memory. The user will repeat this process dozens, sometimes hundreds of times in a night. They will spend hours searching the floor for the cigarette they just dropped, becoming increasingly frustrated, never realizing that they are pantomiming an addiction in a room full of ghosts. Then there are the phantom people. This is the most heartbreaking and dangerous aspect of the trip. A teenager might sit on their bed and have a 3-hour heart-to-heart conversation with their best friend. They laugh, they share secrets, they cry. The presence of the friend is absolute. They can hear the friend's breathing. They can see the texture of their shirt. Then, the user turns their head to grab a glass of water. When they look back, the chair is empty. The realization is not immediate. The user doesn't think, "Oh, I'm hallucinating." They think, "Where did Mike go?" They walk around the house looking for Mike. They call Mike's phone, only to find out that Mike has been in another city all weekend. Or, in darker cases, the user realizes they have been talking to a relative who died 5 years ago. The emotional whiplash of these encounters can cause long-term psychological trauma. Then, there are the insects. For reasons that neurologists still do not fully understand, anticholinergic poisoning triggers a primal fear response involving swarms. Users almost universally report seeing spiders. But these are not cartoon spiders. They are hyper-realistic, often described as mechanical or transparent. They crawl over the walls, cover the ceiling, or, worst of all, burrow out of the user's own skin. The user will pick and scratch at their arms until they bleed, trying to remove parasites that do not exist. But the true horror of the modern Datura trip is not what the user sees. It is what they do. Because the user believes their hallucinations are real, they interact with the world in dangerous ways. A person on LSD might sit on a couch and look at a painting. A person on Datura might decide to cook dinner. They will turn on the gas stove, but forget to light it, then walk away to talk to a phantom. They might decide to drive a car, believing the road is clear, only to swerve to avoid an imaginary truck and hit a real tree. Hospitals see the aftermath. Doctors and nurses in toxicology wards describe Datura patients as the most difficult to treat. They are not sedated. They are often in a state of excited delirium. They thrash against restraints, screaming at invisible attackers. Their heart rates hover near the explosion point. Their bladders fill to the point of rupturing because the muscles required to urinate have been paralyzed by the drug, a condition requiring painful catheterization. And there is no antidote that instantly stops the trip. Physostigmine can help reverse the toxicity, but the delirium must often simply run its course. The doctors can only keep the patient hydrated, restrained, and alive, while the poison slowly leaves their system. When the user finally lands, usually 24 to 48 hours later, the nightmare isn't over. They are left with residual blur. The pupils remain dilated for days, sometimes a week. They cannot read text messages. They cannot read a book. The sunlight hurts. They are physically exhausted, their throat is raw, and their memory is shattered. Most terrifying is the amnesia gap. A user might wake up in a hospital bed with cuts on their feet and mud on their clothes, with absolutely no memory of how they got there. Did they run through the woods? Did they walk down the center of a highway? Did they hurt someone? The not knowing is often worse than the remembering. The Internet, specifically communities like Reddit's Datura or Arrowhead, serves as a digital memorial to these mistakes. It is one of the few places on the drug-using Internet where the community consensus is almost 100 negative. The Trip Reports section for Datura is not a collection of fun stories. It is a library of warnings. Titles like, "I am permanently different now," "The worst 3 days of my life," and "Please God, never again," fill the archives. One famous report details a user who lived an entire alternate life, got a job, found a partner, had children, inside his head, only to wake up on his floor realizing only 8 hours had passed. The psychological grief of losing that life led to severe depression. These stories serve as the modern folklore, just as the indigenous tribes told stories of the dangerous grandmother spirit to warn their initiates. The Internet tells stories of the phantom cigarette to warn the curious. Datura stands as a stark reminder that nature is not benevolent. Just because a plant grows from the earth does not mean it wants to be your friend. In the modern world, where we believe we have conquered nature with air conditioning and smartphones, Datura remains untamed. It is a biological trap door. If you step on it, you fall out of reality. And as we have seen, some people never quite climb back out. In the end, Datura stramonium remains what it has always been, a beautiful botanical paradox. It is a flower that blooms only in the moonlight, yet drags the human mind into the darkest of shadows. It is a biological key that fits a lock we were perhaps never meant to open. From the accidental comedy of the Jamestown soldiers, to the spiritual trials of the Chumash, and finally to the tragic threads of modern Internet forums, the lesson is singular and unforgiving. Reality is fragile. We walk through our lives assuming that the ground beneath our feet and the faces of our loved ones are permanent. But Datura proves that it takes only a few microscopic alkaloids to tear down the walls of the world we know and replace them with phantoms. Let this history serve not as an invitation, but as a warning. Some doors are best left closed. Some mysteries are best left buried in the garden, admired from a distance, but never touched. I am the architect. You have been listening to The Midnight Vault. Sleep well, and may your dreams always remain distinguishable from your waking life.